What does Trump's obsession with Greenland have to do with your mortgage, your Medicare, and whether your kids can afford university? Everything. On Saturday, 18 January, Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Denmark, a 76-year NATO ally, because they wouldn't sell him Greenland. Denmark has been a loyal American ally since 1949. They fought alongside the US in Afghanistan and Iraq. None of that mattered. And that single decision exposes a fundamental risk to Australia's economy that most Australians don't realise exists. We've committed $368 billion to AUKUS, our largest fiscal commitment in decades, based on assumptions about alliance reliability that Denmark just saw tested and failed. That's $368 billion of your tax dollars, betting that America honours its commitments to allies, regardless of political demands. Denmark just found out that bet doesn't always pay off. This isn't a story about foreign policy. This is about where your money is going, what we're not funding as a result, and the very real economic consequences facing Australian families over the next decade. Australia has committed $368 billion to AUKUS over 30 years, roughly $12.3 billion per year until 2051. We've already paid $2 billion in 2025 to upgrade US submarine facilities in America, not Australian facilities. American taxpayer money spent on American infrastructure. We're building the $12 billion Henderson Defence Precinct in Western Australia for US submarine maintenance. We fund it, the US gets access. Current defence spending sits at approximately 2% of GDP, roughly $48 billion annually. Now here's the pressure. Pentagon officials argue Australia should raise defence spending to 3.5% of GDP minimum. That's approximately $84 billion annually, an additional $36 billion per year. To put that in perspective, $36 billion equals the entire annual Department of Education budget. It's more than we spend on universities, TAFE, and schools combined. To find that money, the government has three options: raise taxes, cut spending elsewhere, or borrow more. There are no other options. That's how budgets work. Before we explore those options, understand the economic environment we're operating in. According to the ABS, productivity growth has been stagnant for years. We're not producing significantly more per worker than 5 years ago. The RBA has held the cash rate at 4.35% for 6 consecutive meetings, the highest since 2011. Household debt-to-income ratios are at 186%, the highest in Australian history. That's higher than the US, UK, or Canada. Australian households are among the most leveraged in the developed world. Household savings have collapsed to 1.6%, the lowest since 2008. During the pandemic, savings spiked above 20%. Now, Australians save less than 2% of disposable income. Families have very little buffer, highly leveraged, not saving, elevated interest rates. This is the environment in which we're being asked to find an additional $36 billion per year. Option 1. Increase taxation. $36 billion in additional tax revenue represents 13% of personal income tax, or 30% of company tax, or 45% of GST revenue. You can't raise that with small adjustments. You need significant tax increases. My analysis: if you raise personal income tax significantly, households already at 186% debt to income have less to spend. Consumption falls. Businesses earn less. They hire fewer people. Economic growth slows. Raise company tax significantly, businesses invest less. Productivity growth, already stagnant, gets worse. Raise GST, everything becomes more expensive in an environment where inflation is already a concern. Option 2. Cut spending elsewhere. The federal budget is roughly $680 billion annually. To find $36 billion, you need deep cuts. Social Security and welfare, $220 billion annually. Aged pensions, disability support, unemployment, family payments. Health, $100 billion annually. Medicare, hospital funding, PBS. Education, $50 billion annually. Universities, schools, TAFE. Infrastructure, $15 to $25 billion annually. Roads, rail, ports, energy grid. My assessment, cutting Social Security affects the most vulnerable and largest voting bloc. Cutting health means longer waiting times, fewer bulk billing doctors, higher patient costs. Cutting education means fewer university places, reduced TAFE, larger class sizes, worsening our skills shortage. Cutting infrastructure trades short-term savings for long-term productivity decline. Option 3. Increase public debt. Borrow $36 billion per year. Over 10 years, that's $360 billion in additional debt. Australia's net debt is currently around $600 billion, roughly 23% of GDP. Adding $360 billion pushes that significantly higher. At 4.35% interest rates, $36 billion borrowed costs $1.57 billion per year just in interest. By year 10, you're spending $14 to $18 billion annually just servicing that additional debt, money that could have gone to health, education, infrastructure. Credit rating agencies watch debt to GDP ratios. Australia has a AAA rating. Whether adding $360 billion would trigger a downgrade is speculation, but agencies have downgraded countries for less. A downgrade adds 0.25 to 0.5% to borrowing costs, billions more per year in interest. Each option has economic consequences. The government hasn't said which they'll choose. Now, the other side of the equation, trade. China accounts for 30% of Australia's total exports, approximately $219 billion in two-way trade annually. The breakdown matters. Iron ore. 84% of Australian iron ore exports go to China, worth $69.31 billion in 2024. Australia is the world's largest iron ore exporter. China is the world's largest steel producer. LNG. China takes nearly 1/3 of our liquefied natural gas exports, tens of billions annually in long-term contracts. Agriculture. Wine, barley, beef, lobster, timber. Between 2020 and 2022, China imposed restrictions on multiple Australian agricultural products. Billions in export revenue disappeared. Some industries haven't recovered. The trade surplus with China accounted for 4% of Australia's GDP in 2024. The growth in that surplus contributed 10% of our GDP growth. Here's the structural problem. Australia is economically dependent on China whilst being strategically aligned with the United States through AUKUS. These relationships are increasingly in tension. Scenario 1. Australia complies with US demands on China. The US expects allies to take harder stances, sanctions, trade restrictions, technology controls. China has demonstrated it retaliates economically. We've seen it with wine, barley, lobster, timber, coal. If China restricted Australian iron ore imports by just 20%, that's nearly $14 billion in lost export revenue annually. Mining companies earn less, employ fewer people, regional economies contract. Western Australia loses billions in royalties, affecting state budgets. The multiplier effect spreads through the economy. My assessment, the economic cost of complying with US demands to confront China could be tens of billions in lost export revenue, tens of thousands of jobs, and measurable GDP growth points. Scenario 2. Australia resists US pressure. Trump reviewed AUKUS in June 2025, questioning whether America should sell submarines to Australia when US production can't meet its own Navy's needs. He affirmed AUKUS in October, but only after Australia demonstrated increased spending commitments. That review was leverage. Trump just imposed tariffs on Denmark, a 76-year NATO ally since 1949, who fought alongside the US in Afghanistan and Iraq. None of that mattered when Denmark said no to Greenland. Australia has AUKUS, a bilateral treaty. It doesn't obligate the US to sell us submarines, share technology, or refrain from tariffs. If AUKUS is delayed or cancelled, we're left with $368 billion committed, $2 billion paid, $12 billion in infrastructure, training programs, workforce development, and no capability. There's no alternative supplier. The UK and US are the only countries providing this technology. My assessment, if the US uses AUKUS as leverage, Australia has very limited options. We're locked in financially and strategically. Australian exports to the US are substantial, about $30 billion annually. If Trump imposed 10 to 25% tariffs like he did to Denmark, industries would be affected, jobs lost, revenue declined. We partially comply with US demands, partially maintain trade with China. Both sides could be dissatisfied. China might impose selective tariffs. The US might pressure for more, questioning our commitment, slow-walking technology transfers. We'd be squeezed from both directions, losing trade revenue whilst increasing defense spending to satisfy Washington. Fiscal position deteriorates, deficits widen, debt increases, services are cut or taxes increase, or both. Australia's population is 26 million. $36 billion per year divided by 26 million is roughly $1,385 per person annually. For a family of 4, that's $5,540 every year, either in higher taxes, fewer government services, or increased borrowing that eventually means both. That's more than average electricity costs, roughly 2 months of groceries, more than many families spend on private health insurance, equivalent to half a year of after-school care. If that money goes to defense, it's not available for Medicare, education, infrastructure, or housing. Every dollar spent on defense is a dollar not spent on these priorities. That's not opinion, that's how budgets work. The next federal budget is May 2026. Watch Treasurer Jim Chalmers' language. Fiscal consolidation means tightening, spending restraint, or revenue increases. Difficult choices prepares the public for unpopular decisions. Comprehensive tax review, or modernizing the tax system, often precedes tax increases. If the government commits to 3.5% GDP for defense, demand details. Where's the money coming from? Which taxes increase? Which programs are cut? How much borrowing? If they don't provide details, that's a red flag. Watch trade negotiations with China. If restrictions on Australian products are quietly lifted, negotiations are happening. If Australian ministers visit Beijing more frequently, engagement is increasing. Watch what US officials say about Australia. If Pentagon officials question AUKUS again, that's leverage. If Trump says Australia needs to do more, that's pressure. Watch the RBA. If Governor Michael Bullock warns about fiscal sustainability or government debt, they're signaling concern, which means higher interest rates for longer. Watch credit rating agencies. If they issue a negative outlook, that typically precedes a downgrade by 12 to 24 months. Lower ratings mean higher borrowing costs. Australia has committed $368 billion to AUKUS. We've paid $2 billion. We're building $12 billion in facilities. We're being pressured for $36 billion more annually. Our economic position is constrained. Stagnant productivity, 4.35% interest rates, 186% household debt to income, and 1.6% savings rate. Our trade is concentrated. China takes 30% of exports, worth $219 billion, including 84% of our iron ore, worth $69.31 billion. Trump imposed tariffs on Denmark, a 76-year NATO ally, because Denmark wouldn't sell Greenland. The assumption that the US honors alliances regardless of political demands has been tested. Denmark is experiencing the result. We're economically dependent on China, whilst strategically aligned with the US. Those relationships are in tension. The government hasn't said where $36 billion per year comes from: taxes, cuts, or debt. Each has consequences.
If China retaliates economically, the cost is measurable in tens of billions. If the US uses AUKUS as leverage, we have limited alternatives. The government needs to answer 3 questions. 1. Where specifically will $36 billion per year come from? Actual budget lines, not rhetoric. 2. What's the economic cost if US demands require reducing China trade? How much export revenue is at risk? Which industries? How many jobs? 3. What happens if AUKUS is delayed or altered? What's the backup plan? These aren't geopolitical questions, they're budget questions, economic questions. They affect your taxes, your public services, your cost of living, your economic future. The Denmark tariffs are a data point about how alliances function under Trump. They're evidence that long-standing alliances don't guarantee protection from economic coercion. Australia needs to understand what that means for our fiscal commitments, because the money is already allocated, the economic constraints are already binding, and the choices we make now will shape our economic position for the next decade. Whether we face these scenarios is speculation. That we face difficult fiscal choices is mathematics. The budget is zero-sum. Money spent on defence is money not spent elsewhere. That's accounting. Australia's economic dependencies create exposure. China for trade, US for security. Both come with expectations and potential costs. Right now, we have significant spending commitments, constrained revenue growth, limited fiscal flexibility, and competing economic pressures. That's the structural reality. Stay analytical. Watch the budget. Watch the trade data. Watch the policy announcements. Understand where your money is going, because the decisions being made now in Canberra, in Washington, in Beijing will determine Australia's economic trajectory for years to come. And most Australians don't realise that yet.